are the Lit Ladies.
I'm Christy.
I'm Kelly.
And I'm Carissa.
Three writers and moms exploring how to live out our faith in our literary lives.
We span the country from the coast to the Midwest. And with different stages of life, careers, and favorite genres, we're sure to cover the literary landscape.
In every episode, we'll discuss books we love, reading life, and writing craft, using the Bible as our guide for beauty, goodness, and truth. New episodes drop every other Friday.
Hello and welcome back to the Lit Ladies podcast. Today we'll be discussing horror, a genre that's gotten a lot of negative association for Christians to read. Since the aim of our podcast is to discuss these various topics from a Christian perspective, we'll focus today on some of the Lit Ladies' thoughts.
So our disclaimer here is that the title of this episode is Should Christians Read Horror? But we're not actually going to answer that question for you. But we're hoping that our discussion today will maybe help you answer this question for yourself, maybe rethink a genre that perhaps you've discounted in the past, and just to generate some good discussion.
And to start, let's go ahead and define horror. What do you each think? And before we get into that, Carissa wrote a fairly substantial piece on her Substack, Midnight Ink. So we'll reference some of that today, but it will be in the show notes if you want to do some follow-up reading on that. So Christy, go ahead and tell us, how would you define horror?
I think horror is anything that leaves me looking over my shoulder. You got the fear, the anxiety, it just makes you nervous, which is funny that I like to read horror considering my life brings enough of those feelings in that way. But I think horror is still a form of escape. For the most part, it's a beast in the woods or some kind of monster. It's not the typical day-to-day stress and fears. And we talked last week about what makes a book a Christian read, and we tried not to define it by what it was not. And I think the same applies this week. Horror is not a bunch of do nots. Horror is a genre where pretty much anything goes. There can be blood, there can be death, humor, love, and real and imagined scary elements. It's really a wide field.
I love that definition because it's that most people don't think of horror as having this wide emotional range. You just think of it as just constant fear. But that's actually like the best horror stories will have the whole range: love, heartwarming moments, romance, humor. I'll maybe mention it later, but like, for example, the movie Get Out, it's actually created by, I think he's a comedian, right? And it's like, has so many funny moments. And that actually, I think, balances out the horror and almost like makes the horror worse because you just were laughing like 2 seconds ago. But to me, I think horror is really just something that's a type of story that's meant to evoke fear. And often there's like jump scares or shock, sometimes because something's kind of disgusting, which isn't really my favorite, but might use other narrative techniques to create suspense, like some subgenres too, which may be a conversation for a different episode. But I think that some other genres would be like slasher, folk horror, cosmic horror, psychological horror, which is going to be like way different. It's, all in the mind, gothic, which is totally different subgenre. And I think there is a difference too between horror books and movies. And we're going to reference some movies today just because it's kind of hard to talk about the genre of horror without talking about film. But I do think there's a difference. Personally, I'm not as into horror movies as much as books, but there are still certain ones that I enjoy, like Stranger Things, which I know is a TV show. But I just really love that like subtle dread of terror as opposed to the more jump scares. But of course, that's just a personal preference.
So before we move on a little bit, why do you prefer horror books as opposed to movies or film in general?
Well, I think like just for me, I don't really get scared from movies that easily, but it does. I'm a very visual person. So I think just having something that is like kind of gross or terrifying, like sticks in my brain a little more. But honestly, I think books are scarier because it's really all in your imagination. And I think there's a lot of skill that, like from a writer's perspective, it takes a lot of skill to weave that dread and that terror and that horror just through words. You don't have music. You don't have like a dark screen. You don't have, a jump scare. How are you going to pull the reader in and make them scared. And it's you literally just have the written word.
Such an interesting point. There are so many elements to a film that would contribute to an overall experience with music, with lighting, with weather, with all of these aspects that you can visually see as opposed to straight words on a page. That's a really great point. I had actually never thought about that before. Okay, so is there a difference between horror and terror? And if so, can you elaborate on that?
Yeah, so terror is the dread that you feel before seeing something scary, like knowing something scary is coming, but you don't know what it is. And then horror is the shock and revulsion that you feel from actually seeing the scary thing. You know, horror needs to have both, but for me, I like the terror part the best.
So I was thinking about this when we were preparing for this episode. How would you differentiate between suspense and horror and terror? So if you haven't figured out already, I personally don't like horror very much and I don't read it at all. However, I love suspense books or romantic suspense where the bad guy is taken out and the hero saves the heroine. So I like that kind of terror, like the suspenseful moments, but I do struggle with the creepier elements. So what would you say is the difference?
I think that's a close distinction. In an article about Alfred Hitchcock, he talked about suspense being more enjoyable, obviously, for those of us who enjoy being tied in emotional turmoil knots. But the suspense is more sustainable for this reason. And like a book or a movie, it gives the reader that edge of their seatness. And if you notice in movies, they often show the person's reaction to seeing a monster, but not the actual monster until much later in the story. They may show a shadow or a part of the monster, but the full payout of horror is when our hero faces the creature in its entirety during the climax. And Stephen King says a similar thing about terror being the buildup of fear, and then horror is the actual moment the monster is revealed. And I feel like he's probably knows what he's talking about. All that to say, an argument can be made that terror and suspense are very similar, with horror more of a separate beast, literally.
I need to read Stephen King's book on writing. It's called
It's
On
really
Writing.
good.
Oh, I need to. What's the other one? Danse Macabre? Like, doesn't he have another one about writing horror?
This book, the book on writing, is just a basic thing on writing, which is really good. I don't know. He may have written a book about horror. Oh, yeah. Okay.
Wouldn't you say he's the king of horror?
Yes, the king.
For sure.
The king of horror.
Yeah, I always tell my students, we talk about how he threw away his first novel and his wife dug it out of the trash and made him keep trying. Yeah, and that was Carrie.
Support. Yes,
Crazy.
I do.
I didn't know
that
that
was in that book on writing. He talks about that.
Yeah.
I did not know that.
I would agree with that, Christy. And I would say that a lot of times horror has a more speculative element to it compared to a story that's just pure suspense or thriller. Not that horror has to have a unreal supernatural element, but I think that's often sometimes the distinction. Also, there's like the terror is just different. It's like you don't know what like we talked about before, like you just don't know what you're facing. Whereas like I watched something suspenseful the other day and I'm thinking about this question and I was like, well, we know where the bad guy is and what the bad guy is doing. But in this case, we don't know. And then there's just like this subtle like wrongness that's driving the suspense, not necessarily, that external force. But it makes me think of the movie Get Out, which I mentioned earlier. So that movie is about a young Black man going to meet the family of his white girlfriend for the first time. And so it starts out like very lighthearted. And then throughout the story, it's just a series of little events that maybe on their own they wouldn't seem weird, but like all together, it is just so creepy. The dead deer. And then you've got these like the help at the house is like acting very robotic and very strange. And you just feel like this isn't right. And you're telling him, get out. But it culminates in this sort of like building dread, just like subtle things. But yeah, I mean, none of those really follow the definition of horror, as I shared above, of like things that are shocking or like revolting. But then, they didn't really appear till the end, kind of like Christy was saying. And this film also it uses comedy really well to balance out the horror, which is really interesting too. And it draws out the theme as well, which is like how racism can be very subtle. And would you guys differentiate between suspense and thriller, or are they the same thing? Because I've heard it called thriller, and then I've heard it referred to as suspense.
I'm going to venture to say suspense is like you're anxious and uncertain about what will happen. And I do feel like thriller is closely related, but I think of it as being higher stakes and more jumping from one action to the next. Like Ruth Ware's book, One Perfect Couple, to me, it was more suspenseful in that I'm wondering what will happen next after every situation. Whereas her
Don't
book
spoil
title,
it. Don't spoil it. I'm still halfway through.
Well, I don't feel like this is spoiling it.
Okay. I'm just as a warning. Don't spoil it for me.
If you're okay, but do you know who the villain is?
No.
Because okay, well, I'll say 0 Days is a lot like Harrison
I've read that
Ford's The
one.
Fugitive, where wait, are you in One Perfect Couple or 0 Days?
I've read 0 Days. I'm still halfway through.
Okay,
One Perfect
that's what
Couple.
I was going to talk about.
Yeah.
Yeah, so 0 Days I feel like is more of a thriller in that you know who did it pretty early on. Like it's pretty obvious who did it, but you're still nervous like, is she still going to win? Is she still going to get through to the end? Like Harrison Ford's movie.
The Fugitive. You just mentioned that one. Yes.
Sorry, I just said that. Yeah, so it's like with that one, you know it's the one-armed man. You know it's not him, but it's like he has to go through all these jumps and everything to get through all these situations to outrun everybody. And it's just more of like a thriller and that you know the ending kind of, but you're still in that race.
And I always think of thriller as kind of higher octane suspense. Suspense still feels like there's a little bit of a happy bow wrapped around it.
Oh, interesting.
I could be wrong. I may be totally wrong because I don't know if I have any data or basis for that. That's just in my mind. But thriller I think
is
of
pacing for sure.
Yes, and maybe a little scarier. And then you start getting into psychological thrillers and some of those ideas where it almost feels non-formulaic, like they're trying to do something outside of the box. Whereas I think suspense is often somewhat formulaic or, at least the good guy's going to win. That's just off the cuff.
Well, and people often lump horror and thriller together, which I do find a little odd because I do think they're so different. I guess it's like lumping sci-fi and fantasy together. I'm like, they're so different. Why are you lumping them together? But
I think there are so many nuances within genres that to someone who maybe doesn't particularly enjoy one genre, they'll just lump it all together. Whereas when you're in it or you enjoy it, you might differentiate the different categories more, if that makes sense. So the topic of this episode, do you think Christians can read horror in good conscience?
I hope so, because I don't really feel guilty when I'm reading it.
Conviction.
I love this question.
I'm not feeling guilty. I'm just reading it to enjoy it.
So Christy's answering our weekly question. Okay, keep talking. Tell us what you think, Christy. And Carissa, keep going.
Oh, I agree with Christy. It just kind of comes down to personal preference. I think some people struggle with like violent images, especially like, again, you have to think about movies versus books. I mean, I feel like film is honestly a whole other conversation, but some people, images just stick in their mind, and other people, it just doesn't bother them. I think everyone has their own convictions, but I would challenge anyone thinking about this question to consider how darkness is portrayed in the Bible, because I think there's this temptation for Christians to shy away from content that is dark or sad, but the Bible doesn't do that at all. Like Scripture deals with death and vengeance, and it's gory. And I'm thinking like about Ehud, that story about that judge, like. Oh man, it's like, I did not want to know that level of gory detail. And it deals with people in pain. And I think that also reflects life. Like real life doesn't always have a happy ending. And we often face great adversity and even terror. Another thought with that is there's a good podcast called Believe to See. And they have an episode, it's kind of old now, about horror. And one of the points they made is that it's really the only genre that calls evil evil. it's really also easy for us as Christians for anybody, I guess, to watch content that on the outside, it seems wholesome, but really it's showing evil portrayed as good. I mean, and that's how the devil works, is he's portraying evil as a good thing, like materialism, right? The devil's often disguised as an angel of light, but in horror genre, exactly what the bad guy is. I think the main question to ask ourselves, really in anything that we are consuming, is evil or sin being glorified? And I think it doesn't mean we don't see characters like last time doing bad things, but the question is, overall, is the point of the story to glorify that or no? I mean, Flannery Connor would be a great example of that, like just portraying characters who are like racist or serial killers. And then you go to the end of the story, you realize, oh, like the point is, don't be like that person. And she has this really great, I don't think she actually said it. I think she was like paraphrasing someone else. So I don't know the actual like source of this. So if someone knows, definitely let me know. And I'm just kind of paraphrasing here. But she basically says, I don't write about the rot in the hill because I love the rot. It's because I love the hill. I think that really just gets at like why, I mean, for me personally, why I sometimes write about, darkness or sad things. It's not because I love the sad things. It's because I love the goodness. The darkness is still there, whether we disguise it in beauty or whether it's exposed. And it's because we love the goodness that we deal with darkness.
I love some of those thoughts. And even as a romantic suspense writer, I think that quote applies so well. I don't write about people getting murdered because I love murder. I love when the good guys catch the bad guy and you see that good overcome the evil. And I just love the idea that what is our focus? Is our focus on the good or is our focus on the evil? And I actually had a question that what you said made me think of. In most horror books, do you see a happy ending or do you see a sad ending, or is it just all across the board?
Christy could probably answer better, but I think most of the time there's usually like it kind of ends badly. Right?
I
Isn't
would
that
say
right? It's kind of a trope.
it depends on who you read, because it's funny. I read a Stephen King book, and I don't read him often, but he is an excellent writer. And I read one of his books, and it was almost like the ending was happy. And I was like, oh, it's great. It's going to be happy. And then it's like he had this last scene where it's like, and it just like kind of left me unsettled, because I was like, we were going up and now we tipped down again. But I read a lot of Darcy Coates. In her books, she has a house on the cover. So a lot of them are about like haunted houses or just things that are in houses, whatever. And a lot of those, it's like the heroine overcoming, and they're not all like scary, I guess. It's about the heroine overcoming the ghosts kind of thing, or demons or whatever. Or it's about her like working with them so they feel seen and they can go off about their happy business, whatever. But then you have your other ones that's like, my daughter watched this movie Megan, and it's like this creepy doll.
I don't want to see that.
Yes.
I saw the trailer. I was
She
like,
loves
no.
horror movies. And she watched that, and it's like, there's the defeat at the end, and then yet there's like, like that questionable, like, was she really defeated? And I think a lot of horror stories are like that. And that's where you get your Jason 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 10. I mean, those ones.
So maybe the ending is left open to interpretation, or it's not fully closed out. Okay.
Generally.
Yeah,
Okay.
it's like a hint of like, oh, yeah, you didn't really kill the monster, which I actually don't like that. And a lot of the books I read, I feel like I can think of several. They are horror, but they have a happy ending. So I don't think it's every.
And that's the ones I read.
Yeah.
Just
that's what I prefer.
Everything. There's a spectrum. I know my husband always teases me because I don't like movies that don't answer the ending for me. I want it concluded. I want it wrapped up in a bow. I don't want it left open to my interpretation. It's like those choose your own adventure books. Do you remember that? Do you remember those when you were younger?
Those.
Yeah. I'm like, why would you choose your own adventure? Write it out for me. Okay. So do you think there are any aspects of horror that Christians maybe should not read, or that either of you personally do not like within the genre?
I think some horror, and this is where it gets a bad rep from. It can be like disgustingly gory. Now, I don't
Yeah.
know if that's unchristian or just a personal preference. And the same thing Krista touched on earlier about being visual. Like, I am very visual. So, book words of a scene won't get stuck in my head, but seeing it on a screen would get stuck in my head. So, I generally also don't watch horror movies. And I'll listen to the crime podcasts, but I prefer the ones that focus on the mystery and the interviews and solving the
Yeah.
crime instead of the ones that go into like the minute detail of the gore and like what happened. Because I know that was a real person with like hopes and dreams, and I don't want those images in my head. It's better for me to read horror than watch horror, but I still don't, even if I'm reading it, I don't want it to be gory.
I agree. That's just my personal preference. Like, I really don't like slashers at all. Although I do love a good final girl. It's like, the woman. She's victorious.
What do you mean by
Um,
final girl? Like
yeah,
woman
it's like a
who
trope. I think it's a trope in slashers where it's like the girl, there's a one girl who always survives. Like everybody else dies except for this one girl.
I have quite literally never heard of the
Really?
final girl trope. And I am going to ask our listeners if they've heard of the final girl trope. I'm writing a note so I can ask about that. I love it. Okay, keep going.
Yeah, but I would question if that's like, is it unbiblical to see something that's gross? I don't know. Like I feel like growing up I might have said yes, but I'm just not sure. Like I can't think of anything. I mean, we know whatever is wholesome or true, like think about these things maybe, but yeah, but then that kind of, if you're to apply that verse to everything, then we can't ever think about sad things. That's obviously not a good interpretation of it. So yeah.
I think that's why I love this conversation that we're having. When I was younger, I thought everything was so straightforward, like A plus B equals C. And as I've gotten older, I realized there is more gray area. And sometimes we all have different convictions. So something that I may
Mm-hmm.
be convicted about, maybe neither of you are, or vice versa. And we see that a lot in media. People have different convictions on which movies, books, shows they watch. So it is interesting to sift through what our own individual convictions are. And I mean, I know even when I was younger, my mom wouldn't let me dress up as anything witchy for Halloween. I don't know why. It was like
Same.
demonic in her mind. But we were okay to go trick or treating,
Yeah,
you know.
exactly. I could do a harvest festival, but I think it might
I
have been
know.
more of a safety thing with the weird
Right,
going to
because we were
strangers'
worried
houses.
about
Yeah.
razors and candy and all of that.
Yeah.
I know.
Yeah.
I know.
Okay, but can we just talk about how the fall festival I used to go to as a kid, you were bobbing for apples? I
Oh,
tried to explain that concept to my kids, and they were like, wait, you just put your mouth on these other apples? And I was like, it seemed like a good idea at the time. I don't know.
Our kids are all product of the COVID years where they're
They
like,
are.
we can't
No
share
germs.
these
Yeah.
germs. Okay, so on that note, would you consider witchy or vampire books horror?
I think I'd consider them based on the story, the plot line. Like if we're talking Discovery of Witches or even Twilight, then I'd consider that more speculative. Like
yeah,
there
it's
wasn't
definitely
really
more
scary elements.
it's like the
Yeah.
plot. It's
Yeah,
like
like
how the story is
Dracula.
told. Yeah.
Okay, wait, hold on. Elaborate on that for me. First of all, what do you mean by speculative? Krista mentioned it earlier, but elaborate on what you mean by the plot.
Speculative just means something it's not fantasy, like, or sorry, it's not real. Like it wouldn't happen in real life.
Okay, so what are you saying? You're saying Discovery of Witches or Twilight is more speculative, right?
Yeah, I've never read, but I think Discovery of Witches is it like romance?
It is. It's kind of about a girl who has denied that she's a witch, basically. And
Mm.
then it's almost like it's up to her to figure all this stuff out, but she teams up with this vampire. So there's definitely romance. But it's been so many years since I've read it. I remember it being really good, though, with just
Yeah,
pulling
it's
people
more.
in and just trying to figure out stuff. But I definitely wouldn't say it was horror.
Yeah, I
Okay.
think it has to do with also like the structure of the plot, not just the creepy. If it's like a
Mhm.
horror-esque thing. I mean, we could probably do a whole episode on the vampires. Like the genre is so fascinating the way it's changed over time from the 18th
Dracula.
century. Yeah. Well, even actually before Dracula and to now, it's just very fascinating. But I wouldn't really consider any of those horror except for Dracula.
Okay.
And what about Interview with a Vampire? Now it's been years and
Oh, I've
years
never
since
read
I've seen
it.
that one.
Well, that's
I've
one of
never
the
read
first
it, but I'd
ones.
seen it.
It has
That was a very early one.
Yeah, it has the vampire as the protagonist. That's one of the first one, I think. Anyway, it's kind of, we're digressing, but
We totally should do an episode on the vampire books because I read Discovery of Witches and Twilight in my day. So, because I'm a sucker for a good love story, even if they're vampires. Okay, Carissa, I loved this thought that you had in your Substack, and it was the idea of catharsis. So, I am wondering if reading horror helps you with this idea of catharsis. And if so, how?
So catharsis is from Aristotle. And he had this idea that when you watch a tragedy, it evokes these feelings of pity and fear, but somehow it's kind of like cleansing you of those emotions. I mean, I think everyone's felt like where you like cry really hard, but you feel like better.
Mhm.
It feels like it's like taking a hot shower, like it just feels better. And so he had this idea that that's what tragedy did. So I kind of think that horror does the same thing in a way. You're reading or watching it, and it's like experiencing the emotions of the characters, but at the same time, we're kind of cleansed of those emotions. So maybe it kind of helps us like deal with other terrible things in our lives in a way, even if it's just sort of a relief that's like, well, however bad my life gets, it's not being chased by a monster in the woods bad, right? Like,
It could
For
always
sure.
be worse, sure.
at least
And
that's
I
not
agree.
me.
Yes. I agree with Carissa. I'm relieved there's no psycho chasing me in the woods sort of bad aspect in my life. After watching or reading a horror, I may still feel lingering like creepiness and not be okay with the darkened shadows at the end of my hallway. But most of the horror I read, we discussed, I like the ones that do have that finality to it. But there are some like with the lingering thought, is the monster actually dead? Which is like what we said earlier with their series of Texas Chainsaw, Chucky, Freddy, Jason, all the more like the slasher ones, I would say, where there's like a high body count.
And those are the ones you like?
No.
Or you don't
ones I
like those?
No.
Okay. But do they
Those
give
are
you
the
a
ones
feeling?
that make you feel scared.
They don't
after?
cleanse you.
Oh, those are
They
the ones
don't
that
give you the Aristotle cleansing. They make me
No.
like harbor and hold on to those feelings of fear.
I got what you're saying. You're saying that the horror you read that has the finality to it kind of cleanses you, whereas some of
Yes.
these lingering, non-ending ones do not cleanse
they
you.
don't do much for me.
Okay. So
For me,
interesting.
also, I should say here, because I didn't say it earlier, I am just not into like the demon scary movies, like at all. Spiritual world is real, spiritual warfare is real, and even if the demon dies in the end, or like it's defeated, I don't even want to invite that kind of energy. Like, yeah, and that's not the same conviction for other people, but I just don't like it. Although maybe the exception would be like This Present Darkness by Frank Peretti, kind of different. It's from a Christian perspective. It's a book. But
I
there's
read
angels
that.
in it.
Right. I remember reading
Yeah.
that.
I mean,
So
would you consider that one horror? I don't know.
I never once thought of that as horror, but I read it a
No, me
long
neither.
time ago. Yeah.
No.
But I will say, I want to ask the first horror movie you ever watched and saw, but I want to say, just because it coincides with what Carissa said, I watched this movie called Event Horizon when I was in high school. And it was basically, have either of you seen it?
Mm-mm.
No.
No.
Okay. It was basically about a spaceship that went to the equivalent of hell, and it scared the living daylights out of me. And I grew up in Colorado, and I was at someone's house, like out of town, and I had to drive back through the country home at night after watching this movie. But I just remember thinking, I believe hell is a real place. I can't watch something that has this element of reality to it. It was too much for me. So
Yeah, it's like too real for me.
it was too real.
Yeah.
It's not a figment of my imagination. It was too real, and it turned me off, and probably why I don't really like horror much now. But what about the two of you? That was a bad story about horror. What were the first movies you watched? Where were you? Who were you with? What did you see?
My earliest memory was in fourth grade. We watched Nightmare on Elm Street in school. Now, I can't even imagine how that would ever get through any parent today. We would be on like CNN, some banned class with the angry parents. And I don't even know why we watched it. Like, was our teacher trying to scare us into not sleeping or being good? I don't even remember.
In
I just
school?
remember that. Yep, in school, in fourth grade, we watched that movie. I was terrified. Terrified.
That's a horrible story. I watched, I guess this is my first memory. It's Killer Clowns. I thought it was like a B movie. I was at some sleepover and that's what got picked. And I remember being like, this is a terrible movie, but I don't remember being scared by it at all. It was just like, this is boring. This is not like interesting to me
I
at
remember
all.
being scared of Killer Clowns. And I don't even remember much about it. I think just the clowns in the faces. Like, I don't even remember what the movie was about. Wasn't it Killer Clowns from Outer Space is the full title, maybe?
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't remember that one. But I do remember seeing Critters. And to this day, no body part of mine hangs off the bed. Like, have you ever seen Critters?
No.
Oh, my goodness. Yes.
No, but I have a reoccurring nightmare about snakes getting in my bed. And so every time Christy tells me, how many snakes this week, Christy? 4, 5?
Four snakes this week. I've had 2 in my skimmer, 1 in my shed, and then I had a cottonmouth in the garage. I mean, it's insanity here.
See, why read horror? You have your own horror story in your very own garage.
Yes.
Okay. Do either of you know the history of horror?
I tried my hand at writing a horror story once since I love to read horror, and I really had to learn the pacing and the layout of the plot because it's so different than a romantic suspense storyline. And I remember reading somewhere that the stories that were passed orally were almost like cautionary tales for children, sort of your stay away from the river monster will get you down, which basically meant like, hey kid, don't fall in the river because you'll probably drown. And I feel like the same themes can be found today in like the don't talk to strangers, don't go in the woods at night, don't take the shortcut through the creepy alley. And also something I had read was that the monsters have kind of changed over the years. Like in the 1920s, for that culture that was obsessed with like beauty and the platinum blonde actresses and stuff, all the monsters kind of were like people with deformities and just like monster-like qualities. Because when was Frankenstein written? Was that in that time period?
It was written in the 18th century.
Yeah, so I feel like still though, you have your beauty and you have your culture that kind of frames what makes something scary. Like in the 50s, we had the whole space exploration. So then we had an abundance of alien movies and space invaders. And in the 60s, with the mind-altering drug use, you had your movies and stories based on demonic possessions. The 60s brought in the psycho killer with Hitchcock's obviously famous Psycho movie, and that still holds strong today with the serial killers. And so
I also think like zombies. Zombies
so
too. I mean, there's like a zombie craze. What does that say? Are we afraid of ourselves?
Well, I think you're afraid of illness, especially with COVID. Before COVID happened, you had, what was it? World War Z? No, what was it?
Yes,
Brad Pitt?
Yep.
Yeah. And so it was like that infectious kind, we had outbreak, those infectious. Now I don't think it's a joke, so people don't, make those kind of movies, but it was then. But the horror culture continued to change through the decades, and then it came into, they kind of threw in some humor, like you referenced with Get Out. But even before that, you had like Chucky and Scream, because Scream was a great horror movie. Like it was funny, but then it was also scary. Like, and that was one of those things that I think kind of started around that time. And then you have, now you've kind of got like your torture movies, like the Saw movies, which are not my type of horror at all. Like I want to feel scared, like not squeamish.
No. I'd be interested to know whether like literature has followed the same pattern as film. I haven't read enough.
I think literature would come first.
Yeah, I don't know.
I feel like so many movies are based on books.
They really are. One interesting thought there, I liked what you said at the beginning about the cautionary tales. I feel like that's true, but also even if you look at like Grimm's fairy tales, they some of them are so scary and gross.
They are gross.
Like the Cinderella, the stepsisters cut off their toes to
Yep.
fit into the
I had that
slippers.
edition.
I remember when I do that in class, and they're like, "What? Are you kidding me? I've never heard this version of Cinderella." But
Yeah.
what's fascinating is it has a happy ending. For the Grimm's versions at least. So that's pretty cool.
Mm-hmm.
Do you know when those
Yeah.
Grimm's fairy tales would have been real prevalent, roughly?
So the Grimm brothers, oh gosh, I don't have an exact date, but it was like middle of the 1800s when they were
Okay.
recording these stories. And so it was a linguist and a literature professor, and they were just recording actual oral tales that have been told by people. So, I mean, years before that, they were being told. I mean, who knows how long ago?
I know. It's interesting how things were handed down early because even back in Bible times, there's that verse in Deuteronomy, when you walk and when you talk, think about
Mhm.
these things. Like there was such an oral tradition.
Or the world was in oral culture right until the printing press
Which makes
in
sense. Yep.
in the 1400s, and so then that's changed. So life has
Right.
changed so much. I think sometimes people consider Frankenstein to be the first horror novel or the first science fiction, which is really interesting that it gets both of those. And fun fact, it was written by a 16-year-old, the first
I
version
didn't
of it.
know that. That's
I love
crazy.
the story of how Frankenstein was written. So Mary Wollstonecraft, I don't know if she was married to Shelley at the time, but they ran away and they were in this house with Lord Byron, if you've ever heard of him, famous poet, and John Polidori, and I think some other people too, like her friend or something like that. And were they in Austria? Now I'm going to get I should have looked up all the details. But so they were all stuck in this house. And because of like a volcano having gone off, it was a super rainy and cold summer. So they were all stuck in the house and it was storming and they were bored. And so they challenged each other who could write the scariest story. And so they all went off and wrote them. And then John Polidori wrote Vampire, which is what people think Dracula is based on, because Dracula came later. And then she wrote, Mary Wollstonecraft wrote Frankenstein, the story that would eventually become Frankenstein. Of course, it changes after that, but it's fascinating, like she was so young and now we have this and it's literally changed the horror genre forever.
That is so interesting. I didn't know that. And that's fascinating.
In Frankenstein, too, there's a lot of really interesting themes. A lot of people think that Frankenstein's the monster, but it's actually the scientist. And it really asks a lot of questions about nature versus nurture, really biblical questions about like calling out to your maker, like, why did you make me? It's really interesting. One of my favorite books, actually.
I think something that is so interesting that I'm hearing throughout this discussion is how this genre isn't necessarily just the first impression, that there are layers behind it that would make you think about beauty or goodness or creation, good and evil, moral truths. There's so much more behind some of these stories. And I don't know that I would have considered that before. I think prior to this discussion, I would have just thought, horror scary. I don't like that feeling. Therefore, I won't read it or watch it. But when I look at it from this angle, like you were saying with Frankenstein, there's a lot of, meat there to sift through. And I really like that. It brings a lot to literature.
And I think horror books can teach you a lot. They teach you how to think outside the box when it comes to defeating an unknown enemy. Like in the movie Signs, spoiler alert, it's an old movie. Y'all should have watched it by now. It turns out to be water. It's got the best setup in that movie, too. But in most horror books, your hero is outmatched in size and strength when it comes to monsters. So they have to think of some other way to win. And human evils, I mean, you got Hannibal, and they're different, and they're usually evenly matched physically, or maybe not, because there is the movie Unbroken with Bruce Willis and Samuel Jackson. Is that right? Anyway, Samuel Jackson has this fragile bone disorder. So he's clearly not a formidable opponent physically, but mentally he is. So human evils are different. And the hero still has to find a way to figure out like how to overcome. So I think it's a good way to think outside the box and defeat your enemies.
That makes me think of Stranger Things too, as maybe I didn't talk about it earlier, but yeah, Stranger Things has that really good mix of that emotional range because like why do we like it, right? It's the kids, it's those hilarious middle schoolers, it's the budding romance, it's the unlikely friendships. I just love it. But also like the terror or the monster that they're facing is just like so big. It's like they would never be able to do it on their own. And even together, it's like, how in the world are they going to solve this? It's always like this, like, well, not in those, but in Stranger Things, it's like this ancient evil. But I think that even harkens back to like our like our plight as people, like this ancient evil that it feels impossible to defeat, you know? There's this really good quote by G.K. Chesterton, but I'm going to give the Neil Gaiman version of it because it sounds a little easier to understand for our modern ears. But he says, fairy tales are more than true, not because they tell us dragons exist, but because they tell us dragons can be beaten. And Chesterton, in his quote, he says, if you read his whole section, he says, the baby is already intimately acquainted with the dragon. I just think that rings true because we already know that evil exists. We don't need to be told that. I think it's just a really fascinating point. And I think that's why I write, maybe not, I wouldn't really consider it horror, maybe like elements of horror, but maybe that's why I have some of those elements in there is I love that hopeful ending.
Well, we've certainly covered a whole spectrum of the horror genre today. And in the future, we will do a book recs episode. I think Carissa and Christy both have a fair amount of books from various subgenres that they'd be willing to recommend. So today, we are so glad you joined us. Don't forget to follow us on social media at Lit Ladies Pod. We hope you were able to expand your thinking on this somewhat unique genre. And we'll leave you with a quote from Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, where there is no imagination, there is no horror. Thanks again for joining us. Tune back in next time.